We have here today scientists and filmmakers. We have astrophysicists, geneticists. We have all sorts of hybrids as well. We have roboticists who have been the subjects of films. We have filmmakers who have degrees in the philosophy of mind and artificial intelligence, and so on and so on. And I think although we look comfortably seated, there are actually 40 or 50 people sitting up here. What is interesting for me, having done this several times in the past, is that this really is a kind of ongoing 7-year conversation, and it picks up every year some of the threads from the previous years. And so there's an amazing continuity, which I think also suggests a timeliness and a resonance to all of these topics. And in past years, we've tried to focus on one particular theme, whether it was genetics or some particular space exploration facet. But today, it's going to be, in a sense, both more general and more specific. We're going to look at very particular points of contact between film and, more generally, kind of visual narrative, I guess, and science and technology as it develops. So from right to left, we have Duncan Jones. And why don't you go ahead and give yourself a little introduction?
Sure. My name's Duncan Jones. I'm the director of Moon. My background before I became a filmmaker was working in philosophy, in particular applying ethics to non-organic sentient beings when I was doing my graduate degree. But I wanted to become a filmmaker, and I've tried to continue sort of investigating how technology and science might affect human beings and basically tell stories about human beings and how the future might sort of affect people.
Fran?
I'm a professor of astrophysics and planetary science at University of Colorado in Boulder. My interest is the giant planets, particularly the magnetic fields of the giant planets and how their strange moons interact with those magnetic fields. I work on various space missions. Most recently, the New Horizons mission to Pluto, which just was launched 3 years ago and is about a third of the way to Pluto, and we'll get there on Bastille Day 2015.
Right.
I'm from the genetics department at the University of Utah. I've been involved in the Human Genome Project from its inception, and have been delighted to be part of this revolution that we're in the middle of. The specific things that I work on are details of how genes are turned on and off, and how one gene can give more than one protein product. A little esoteric for this setting, but I thought the excitement that this genome technology brings to us as a society is hard to get your head around, and it'll be fun to have more chat about that.
My name's Rodney Brooks. I'm a professor of robotics at MIT. And at MIT in the last 15 years, I've been building robots with human form and having robots that people can interact with in a almost equal basis. I also start companies that build robots and sell them. One of them is iRobot, which makes the Roomba, the home cleaning robot, and military robots, which don't have human form at all. And most recently, I just started a new little company called Heartland Robotics, which is trying to change the way robots are used in manufacturing and revitalize American manufacturing, hence Heartland Robotics.
Hey everybody, it's magnificent to be here. My name's Alex Rivera. I'm a filmmaker. I won the Sloan Award last year with my film Sleep Dealer, which was the result of many years of thought and work. And the work that I do is interested in politics and in social relationships and in power, essentially, in our society, how power is exercised. And I find that technology and science is almost always present in those relationships and those dynamics. And so I made a science fiction film that looked at some of those questions from a unique angle, and hopefully we'll see a clip of that later on. But anyways, it's excellent and a total honor to be here.
And I'm Jeffrey Nachmanoff. I guess I'm sitting in what was John's seat before. I am also a filmmaker. I recently wrote and directed a movie called Traitor with Don Cheadle, but I'm here really because I was the co-writer of a film called Day After Tomorrow, which came out a few years back, and there's probably a lot of people saw it was a big popcorn movie about global warming, directed by Roland Emmerich. And I've been interested in science and science fiction, and have written a number of scripts that deal with things that handle this in sort of a fictional way. So without further ado, let's
dive in, yeah. So the title again of this panel is 2020 Visions, and I think the implication is intended to be, how are we doing things today in science and film that are anticipating what stuff will be like in the year 2020. That's only 11 years away. But I think, you know, again, as Doran pointed out, things are moving at such a rapid pace, and people's imaginations are fired enough that that I think it's equally relevant to discuss what's going on today that will be valid at, you know, well, if we take military time, 8:20 p.m. tonight. So I'd like to bounce back and forth between those notions of what 2020 is. And let's start with an idea that's almost ridiculously general and vague. So considering film's general capacity to convey ideas, causality, relationships between space and time and emotions and place and image, for the filmmakers, is science sort of coming up with more and more stuff that's increasingly alluring as a topic or as sort of sub-theme? And to the scientists, is film doing a better job at conveying, or is film, is it learning actually to do a better job than it has perhaps in the past of indicating genuinely deep ideas of science, even if it has to do it in a kind of abbreviated form?
I think if you talk to all three of us filmmakers, we would probably answer with a resounding yes to this question of, does science keep coming up with things that are interesting to us to tell stories about? There's no doubt, it's such a broad thing, science, but in particular genetics, robotics, and space exploration is actually something I think we've seen a lot of in past films. I think to me, the cutting edge technology, the things that are just happening now are probably the most exciting things to explore. Film's a way to grapple with things that are difficult for us to wrap our minds around. And so for me, I could speak, but maybe for you too as well, if you get interested in a subject, if you can find a way to tell a story about it, that's a way, it's actually fun. It's like reading books about something you've just become interested about. The only difference is we're doing it as our vocation as well as our hobby.
I would say also, I feel like as a fan, an armchair kind of fan of science, I feel like whenever I get to dive in and really learn what's really actually happening, I feel like we're living in a moment where real science is kind of further ahead and more than science fiction, you know, and where things that were imagined in science fiction scenarios are now yesterday's news. And as filmmakers, I feel like we're standing on like a sea of marbles, trying to like keep up with what is happening in science and digest it and put it into stories. And you know, even if we're just making a movie about people going on a date, it takes 4 or 5 years to get it made. And so if you're making a movie about scientists that take 4 or 5 years, by the time you've made the movie, the inspiration is now yesterday's news. So I feel like science is moving incredibly quickly. You know, one of the themes I looked at in my movie was drones. You know, and 10 years ago I imagined remote warfare conducted, you know, by drones, pilots sitting on the ground controlling remote bombers halfway around the world, and the ethics of that. And lo and behold, by the time the film gets out, now it's a period piece.
I would just say that communications technologies may be the death of the thriller. I think being able to have a cell phone in any given situation makes it so much more difficult to write a viable thriller. But I think, but it also gives you the opportunity to sort of maybe come up with new ideas and new stories that you wouldn't otherwise have devised.
Rod, would you say that do you in your line of work struggle against sort of advanced or too advanced depictions of your own field?
Well, I think artificial intelligence and robotics has suffered a little from Hollywood's, for many years, love affair with the storyline that the computers or the robots are going to get together and take over the world. I asked Peter Norvig, chief scientist at Google, they've got this enormous network, bigger, more computers talking to each other, if they had noticed anything, not malevolence, but just any unexpected periodic stuff happening in the network, anything, and they haven't seen a single thing. Now that could mean it's just in there hiding, so I think AI has suffered from that storyline. On the other hand, some of the movies that have been very influential on me. When I was a teenager in Australia, the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, was just mind-blowing to me, depicting Hal as this super intelligent being who was a psychotic killer, but that was a small thing. And going back and looking at that particular movie, I think that's the movie that stood up the best over time in its depiction of what computer technology would be like in the future. But often I think Arthur C. Clarke said, we tend to overestimate technology in the short term, but underestimate it in the long term. So the longer term depictions of technology far in the future are already quite dated. The Star Trek communicator is nothing. That's for 400 years in the future, but it's nothing compared to this, and what it can do. So
I think the film has a great role to play in a science like genetics, where everything you're working with you can't see. It's all done by inference. We talk about things as if we see them, but we don't see them. I think there are good examples where film has done a great job at making a sort of visual impact in the way that it's hard for us in the trenches to be able to do. This science of genetics, of course, raises lots and lots of ethical questions. I think those are just beginning. I think by 2020, it's pretty clear that when you walk into the doc's office, the first thing that will happen is that your genome is going to be sequenced, and those 3 billion bits of information will be the basic part of your medical record. And dealing with that information, how we use that, is what it's all about right now. But dealing with the ethical issues that are raised about privacy, about predisposition to disease, about the ethics of cloning, for instance, there's going to be a lot of good material there. And it's an area where we as scientists doing this stuff really need help. And I think film is a great way to do that. So I really look forward to this time up to 2020 as a way that, as a time that'll be very helpful and very synergistic with the genetics that's going on.
It seems to me that there may be an opportunity here to try to get people to understand something more about the ethics of complexity, because what you just described, the instantaneous sequencing of your genome as you walk into the doctor's office, has sort of a more relativistic, potentially, implication than, let's say, taking an X-ray of an evidently fractured bone. And people, I think, have a hard time sometimes understanding that although science has produced these metrics, these ways to understand and measure the phenomenal world, they each come with a sort of statistical interpretation. And that's often, I think, the locus of misunderstandings.
Yes, that is certainly a really crucial issue. We hear about a gene that's defective and specifically causes a disease like cystic fibrosis. And there are a bunch of those, a couple thousand, where a single gene defect causes a disease. But they're all fairly rare diseases. They're crucial for the people that have them, of course, but relatively rare. All the common diseases, high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, all those things that are much more likely to affect all of us are going to be very, very complicated. And even though we have all these bits of information stored in our medical record, coming up with an estimation of how that affects your health or your prognosis is going to be very slow in coming, and it's going to come in the form like you have version 26 of gene 823, so you're 10% more likely to have a heart attack before age 40. How are we going to deal with that? And there are going to be 30 other genes which will have to say something about your likelihood of getting a heart attack before age 40. So these are, so getting people to understand this probability issue is going to be a real challenge. And I think here too, there's a great opportunity for education that can come from many different forms.
That's what Steve Pinker's piece we were talking about the other day
is
about, it, how perfect information is going to give you imperfect actionable knowledge. So, but I'm curious, just in terms of, as a screenwriter, and particularly in mainstream Hollywood, it's always so much easier to tell a story about the perils of science than about the sort of incremental progress. And for genetics particularly, I wonder whether you find this sort of, is it useful or is it hysteria to get people worked up about genetically modified foods, to get people worked up about genetic databases for crime, for all the obviously positive tools that you can use genetic modification for are equally and much easier in terms of a narrative we're talking about. It's much easier to put into a scare narrative than it is here's something that could be useful for you to understand as the public.
Right, that's a real challenge, and of course the mad scientist who's modifying genes is a wonderful place to start. But But you mentioned genetic modified foods. I mean, here's a great example where the public information that's out there and that is subscribed to by many, many people is just wrong. The clarity has not come over that issue. People are very passionate about it. And I think because the information wasn't delivered well in the beginning and is now built in to the U.S. society, much less than European societies.
Strangely, that's one case in which we're more progressive than the Europeans, who are deathly afraid of genetically modified food.
Absolutely, yeah. But that's a good example where the effects of science were not predicted at all, and we have not responded very well to try and correct that and get sense into the discussion here.
I'll just chime in to say that I'm one of the ones afraid of genetically modified food, personally. I'm very yeah. Well, but I would say no matter what, as a storyteller, and if you traffic in drama, you want to traffic in peril. If you're telling a love story, it's not you can't say I'm telling you about how love is easy, and that's not a story. It's got to be about a struggle. It's got to be about fear. It's got to be about conflict. And that's what produces drama. And so as storytellers, when we delve into science, we always look, we're not making public service announcements, we're making dramas, and so we need to look at fear, and we need to look at conflict, and but I do think in Hollywood, in the science films and science fiction films that we all know, Terminator, iRobot, Gattaca, I mean, so many, let's start with a fascistic state, let's start with robots that wake up and want to kill their human masters, Blade Runner, I mean, and we traffic in these very, very large, overwrought questions when the really terrifying questions are the tiny ones. What happens between a couple who's been together for 20 years and then all of a sudden they can go to the doctor's office and find out that one of them will become deathly ill in 5 years? How does that affect the relationship? To me, that's a Sundance science film where a fascistic state where everyone's genomes are in a database and that is, to me, a different treatment that's maybe less subtle. To me, I'm less interested in a robot traveling through time to kill humanity than I am in a robot taking an auto worker's job. That to me is terrifying.
Although in Terminator 2, he's a good robot.
Exactly. So I think it's the nature of the peril that we look at. We're inevitably, as filmmakers, going to be staring into those questions. Are we asking the right questions? Are we asking about the things we really should be afraid of?
Although space itself is never the bad guy, right?
Well, yeah. Okay, so usually you have to put humans into space to make the drama, or bugs or something like that. So actually, I was going to come back and talk a little bit about this idea of complexity, because related to the issue of complexity, and particularly in the public's mind, is the idea of nonlinear or feedback systems that happen, and things get carried away very rapidly. And so I don't think we've seen the fabulous, though the day after tomorrow was, I think there will be many more on environmental issues. And when we start thinking about geoengineering, in engineering the environment, putting stuff into the upper atmosphere to try and cool it down and things like this. Similarly for planets, what I'm very interested in is the idea of we go out and explore planets. For example, the moon Europa around Jupiter, which if you 2001, you know what I'm talking about, is a moon that may well under the ice have an ocean with some kind of biota underneath. Everybody jokes about whales on Europa in my world. It probably isn't whales, but it could be some kind of bugs of one kind or another, which would be fascinating to study, maybe similar, maybe very, very different. But understanding how they got to be that way, we have to go there. And to go there, we will inevitably bring our own bugs with us. And I say us, I mean robots doing this. And so, then there's the ethical issue of going in and polluting another environment before we're able to study it, or even afterwards. So there's a lot of interesting issues in space related not so much to the evil of space or humans in space, though the humans in space will always be a popular topic. Just with the robotics side, there's an issue of relationship to climate change, comparing climate change on other planets with our climate change. that we're experiencing here, as well as environment change and the impacts on other biota, not just the humans here and the biota here on the Earth. So lots of fun stuff to work with in outer space. A little further to go, but you can always find a way to get there quickly.
Let's talk about imagery for a second. Is film teaching science and technology over the years new means of communication? Because one of the problems that science has is, one of the main problems, I would say, is a communication problem between itself and its sometimes kind of hermetic or inwardly directed pursuits, and then a more general public who, after all, are going to be the beneficiaries or the victims of whatever comes out. And of course, that puts it in ludicrously black and white terms. But it seems that, you know, as the preeminent visual medium of the last century and probably for centuries to come, film ought to be upgrading the ways in which even complex ideas can be conveyed through visual analogy or direct depiction. Does anybody see that happening?
I think ideas get depicted through narrative reinterpretation more commonly than sort of pure visual reinterpretation. I think that when you look at the movies that are and the TV shows, frankly, that have had an impact. If you look at Star Trek, I know we don't want to digress into a 20-minute discussion of Star Trek, which this panel happens, I've been told in the past. But, you know, it's enormously influential on scientists because most scientists grow up being interested in, you know, I think there's the science fiction somehow sparks an interest in science. We were talking earlier about, among all the scientists on the panel, the things that got them interested, which might be interesting for people to hear. And they're often really pop culture because let's face it, when you're 12 years old, you know, you're not interested in the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You are interested in the idea maybe portrayed in 2001 or in Star Trek or in some other mainstream. Like I got a lot of really gratifying letters from teenagers after Day After Tomorrow came out because they were just excited about someone who's a grown-up making a movie about global warming. And at the time, particularly, it wasn't that long ago, but there was a lot of, we talked about this, repression of the idea of talking about global warming in the mainstream media and press. So it took a really fun popcorn movie to get people to see it. And for 12 and 13-year-olds, that was a way for them to connect with it. And then they go off and their attitudes towards the problem and towards climate science are completely different, even though there's this really simple thing that's been given to them. So I think that kind of communication of complex ideas, film is really good at. I don't know how useful a 2-hour film or even a longer film can be at trying to distill hard science, complex science ideas into movies, but I'd be curious to hear the other people.
I do think, I mean, it might be an interesting moment to get into the concept of these feedback loops and the fact that there's ways in which I'm sure, we all know fiction, and which is often on the forefront, imagining things that don't exist. They're the first to design it, the first to visualize it, and then those visions fill our society, and of course the minds of scientists who then bring these imagined devices into our lived reality. In my process, I kind of went the other way around, in the sense that I looked at robots working in Detroit and in car factories, and I looked at factories in China where our iPods are manufactured, and I looked at those kinds of real-world images as inspiration for my fiction. I wanted to make a very near-future fiction. The main character in my movie is a young man in Mexico who today would maybe make the decision to up and leave his village and come here to the United States to work. But in this future, the border's closed, and so that's not an option. But the global economy has kind of created another option.
Obviously, I take a different view of it. In the same way that personal computers didn't get rid of office workers, it changed the nature of work that people do. I see robotics as changing the nature of what manual work is. And in particular, we have this looming demographic crisis of the baby boomers getting old, and we worry about how Social Security is going to be funded, but there'll be less people around to provide the services, and you can steal, the nurses from the Philippines for a while, and plunder other countries, but you also need to figure out how to provide services for the people who've had their genome sequenced and are being made to live longer.
If we're going to challenge the ethics of things in robotics, I think the real interesting questions also come from which I know is also some of your field, this the changing nature of warfare when you've got these, UAVs or predators that can go and take, you can take a flight into territory that we couldn't have gone into before. What happens when in the near future, the swarming robots we're talking about can take the place of an infantry incursion into a Fallujah? So the losses are going to be so small that the political costs become smaller and smaller for the United States, or for any country for that matter. And those ethics are going to be challenged, aren't they, a little bit?
There's going to be a whole lot of ethical challenges as robots get brought into the infantry, which is underway. And one of the questions is, should robots be allowed to have be allowed to shoot without a person in the loop? And you can make an argument that things will be much more. Because of the lower losses, there will be more incursions. But you can also make an argument that if it's a robot, the robot can afford to shoot second, whereas a person won't take that chance. And we've seen what that leads to when people bust into houses in urban warfare because they don't want to take the chance. So, I think all these ethical issues are complex. There's a little company in Pittsburgh that called Atheon that makes robots to work in hospitals to carry stuff from the dirty dishes down to the kitchen, and because you can't get enough people who do those jobs. And rather than be 100% reliable, which would be very difficult, because hospitals now have 802.11 pervasively in them for all the handheld devices, these robots, about once every 3 days, a given robot will get stuck and not know what to do. So back in Pittsburgh, there's an operations center where it calls home, and now a person uses their visual cortex for 30 seconds to figure out what's wrong, control the robot, get it out of the problem, and off it goes. So instead of being 100% reliable, it only needs to be 99.97% reliable, and the whole business model becomes possible.
And there's visual cortexes are a lot more affordable in Bangalore than they are in Pittsburgh. So
no, actually, it's cheaper. Now it's cheaper in Pittsburgh than Bangalore.
Is that right?
Yeah, Bangalore is not. Other parts of India, maybe, but not Bangalore.
So there's certainly a lot of ethics to do with considering what things should be not done or prevented or limited in some way. And then there's, I think, a different kind of ethics that's incumbent on us as citizens and as governments that have had ebb and flow of interest in science or belief in science. And that's the ethics of things that really need to be done. And that gets us, of course, into the issue of funding. And I think that perhaps, Fran, your position is one here on the panel that's most directly in that category. When a popular film like Contact emerges, is there a palpable reaction in the funding hose?
Unfortunately, I don't think the members of Congress watch enough movies. So
I think they probably don't.
So they probably don't. Not so strongly affected. The public are very strongly affected and very supportive of space. There's no question. You ask anybody, would you pay the equivalent of a cafe latte per person per year, which is what it costs to do a big mission like the Cassini mission to Saturn, delivering these fabulous pictures of moons and geysers and rings and all sorts of fun things on Titan coming back. That sort of cost, everyone says, of course, let's do it. It's very important, inspires young people. I go and give talks about Pluto. Whether or not you want to call it a planet, the 9-year-olds, the 10-year-olds are all love Pluto and are nuts about it and dying to see what this little icy planet looks like. So I think they're inspired, and that really is what brings the money and changes the money coming in. I think that we will not see a huge change in that. It's something that the government always supports and that the public always supports. The big change I think we're going to see is in the issue of environmental funding of environmental science, particularly observing the Earth from space, understanding how the atmosphere works, understanding how climate works, the relationship between the atmosphere and the oceans, all this sort of stuff. And that is much more dependent on various public interest. And the public interest is enormous, no question. And I'm sure Day After Tomorrow made a big impact. I think it really did.
Three-tiered. We talked about it. Number one is scare people. First you make a movie that scares people, and instead of scaring them about a giant shark or an asteroid, you scare them about climate change in hopefully a way that gets them. The second is you try and inform them which actually Davis's film, The Inconvenient Truth, kind of came out a couple years after, and yeah, and I think that helped a lot on that sort of. And then it goes out of the hands of film to a certain extent. Now people are kind of aware of the problem. The change on the radar is phenomenal. When Day After Tomorrow came out, there was, you know, below something like 50% of the population, but a lot of people still believe that it was not a real problem, or it didn't exist, or was made up by Hollywood liberals. There was a number of, I had a couple fun stories with these guys when the movie came out. Under the Bush administration, they issued a gag order to some of the scientists in both NASA and NOAA not to talk to the press about the theory of abrupt climate change or the movie. It lasted for about 3 or 4 weeks before someone made a story out of it in the New York Times, and then it was just kind of embarrassing. It's like, you know, it'd be like saying to NASA, don't talk about asteroids hitting the Earth when Armageddon comes out. It's, you know, we don't want to scare people. And yeah, you know, it moves the public consciousness, and then it goes into a realm beyond film. But I think it's absolutely without question that popular entertainment moves people's concerns. I mean, there have been measured increases since the popularization of CSI, the TV show, in the number of applicants to forensics programs. There have been articles written about how it's changed juries and their ability to make, prosecutors have a harder time making cases because the program is so popular. People believe if you can't get a perfect fingerprint or DNA match, you don't have enough proof. So it's actually affecting, that's lives and deaths, and that's, and I don't think the makers of CSI had any plan to do that one way or the other, but those are the unintended consequences of entertainment. I mean, we could go out, there are lots and lots of cases of that. I mean, unmanned spacecraft is a really interesting one for me because I've been reading a little bit about that. I mean, the notion of Top Gun, and the military has made a long and successful campaign to glamorize the notion of pilots. Well, if we could say objectively that there's absolutely no reason to put a pilot in a plane anymore, you still have a big public problem there because the same thing is true of space exploration with human exploration. It's a romantic notion, and we have done a lot for that. You know, your film is a little bit about that notion of is it you know, astronauts are still figures for movies. Well, whether or not they're relevant for space exploration, I don't know.
I would love to know if people involved in space exploration are looking forward to the day where there's some obvious profitability in going into space, because surely that's where the industrialization of actually trying to get into space and having an attempt to colonize space, that's when it's really going to take off, is when it's profitable.
Yes, I think so, but it's going to be hard to find something that's profitable just because it's so hard and difficult and expensive to get into space. So there's this idea that you can go out to asteroids and bring back precious metals is a great idea, and a lot of people are very keen and enthusiastic to do that. But if you look at the economics, it's unlikely to really happen. Similarly, mining of helium-3, we could go into that one. You know, so the economic feasibility of doing these things, undoubtedly, if it were to become feasible, economically feasible, it will happen, no question about it.